Welcome to Conjuncture. My name is Jordan Camp. I'm really delighted to be here with Thulani Davis. She is a professor and Nellie McKay Fellow in the Department of African American Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's an interdisciplinary scholar and writer who works across multiple genres. She's the author of a number of foundational works, including My Confederate Kinfolk, Nothing But the Music, Maker of Saints, 1959, as well as Malcolm X, The Great Photographs. She's also the librettist for X, The Life and Times of Malcolm X opera, and she also received a Grammy for liner notes for Aretha Franklin's Queen of Soul, among many other awards. Her new book, The Emancipation Circuit, Black Activism Forging a Culture of Freedom, was just published by Duke University Press. In this extraordinary study, she innovates the ways that we understand the geography of freedom in the post-Civil War era. Through extensive archival research and spatial mapping, it traces the development of Black political theory and praxis in this dramatic moment. I'm really delighted to have the chance to sit down with her today to talk about the Emancipation Circuit, Black political thought, and the unfinished business of freedom struggles here at the workshop in New Orleans. So thanks so much for taking the time to sit down and speak with me today, Thulani. I really appreciate it.
I'm glad to be here.
So I wanted to start by talking about the Emancipation Circuit, which you describe as a system of regional networks that were built on labor sites and shipping routes that created and connected communities that was born of abolition. And so can you talk about how these sites became such central places of opposition in this period?
Okay, sure. During the war, starting in 1861, when the Union Army came to Virginia, people got the idea that if they could get to the Union lines, the Union was going to protect them from the slavers, basically, and they fled there. So 3 guys went to Fort Monroe in a rowboat from Norfolk, and a year later, 10,000 people, including my ancestors, were in that fort. So there's a series of settlements that got built from displacement during that time. Lincoln had a map of where the slave populations were. He assumed his troops were going to displace people who were enslaved. So he was trying to figure out where those places would be. Where they turned out to be is the basis of communication between enslaved people who are now fugitives. They have to be protected to a certain extent. They certainly were liable to be killed by the Confederates, and they're also seeing slavery as a system. If one of the tenets of slavery was to keep people from moving. So people taking these journeys for members of certain families, it might have been their first journey off of a plantation. They may have gone 20 miles, they may have gone 50. A lot of people walked, but when they got there, if they saw 10,000 other people who were enslaved, they would have had the same experience Union soldiers did of realizing this was a huge sort of world of enslaved people in the South. They also would have seen people from plantations near them. They might have seen people they knew. But in any case, where they ended up settling in their first settlements, moving off the grounds of a fort, for instance, they would build a kind of shanty town out of old lumber the Union Army wasn't using. They are connecting with other communities that are in the immediate vicinity, and they have the privilege to move. They have open-air religious services, so they're meeting people that way. But where they build permanent settlements, whether it's in like my hometown where the streets were named Union Street or Lincoln Street, they had connections that they could use that were from the slave system. For instance, in my hometown, slaves did fishing. They went out on boats every day. They knew how to travel the waters the same way the first 3 guys fled from Norfolk to Fort Monroe. They knew how to do that. So they start having meetings with people across that 4-mile stretch of water. So it works kind of like that. And where we know there are Black settlements in big cities in the South, they're very old, but they also have connections to nearby communities. And I find it extraordinary because they're physically taking manifestos to meetings by wagon, horse, and boat. And then later in Alabama, for instance, Selma and Montgomery, the people in those communities are connected and travel. When the voter registrar is killed in Montgomery, people from Selma took arms and went there to defend the people, although the sheriff stops them, but they were doing it by train. So that's what kind of alerted me to the fact that they were able to organize large regions. And also the seats of Black power that they built were not where you would necessarily think they were. In Virginia, they were not in Richmond, which you might assume because it was the most populous place. But Richmond was being fought over all during the war, so it became Petersburg. And Petersburg had a free Black community and a Black church and other community building institutions. So they end up electing more people from there than any place else. And then 2 counties away, maybe the biggest Black population in Virginia was in one of those counties. They didn't elect anyone because they were probably terrorized not to participate in voting. So I think I try to point out all of these places are on the same train line that tobacco is traveling from Richmond down to Danville and then into the heartland of cigarette making in North Carolina and then around to Norfolk. So this is carrying people who load and unload, and they're carrying information.
Yeah. No, it's extraordinary that you take us through, and we can come back to this state by state, organizing for Virginia, right through, Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas. And in the book, you suggest that one of the tools that were available for free people has to be understood through a theory of the political. And you point out particularly an analysis of the role of the state and centrally focus on political organizing. So I wonder if you could help us comprehend their conception of the political and the theory of politics.
Well, I have this contention that a movement that's going to mobilize people has to have a theory of the political. That's different from a strategy, but it lays out the vision of where we want to go. Enslavement is an incredible lens through which to decide what is freedom, because there are so many minute restraints on freedom that they had a very capacious sense of what real freedom should be. And these might be things people who had never been enslaved would not even think of. At the same time, they were expressing the usefulness of certain skills and empowerment they had gained. For instance, women were used to being vocal in meetings. Among enslaved people, their opinions were more respected. Men were not doing this presentation of masculinity that involved shutting up women and their thoughts. So they come into the process without even thinking they have to ask for that or expect that as a horizon to get to, but they use it in order to organize. So their ideas about freedom were way beyond, I think, what abolitionists had in mind, because the abolitionists were actually really unfamiliar with the system. So they wanted to be able to have autonomy over their bodies. They wanted to be able to live in community as opposed to having every house be autonomous. So when people tried to build housing for them in a circle with lots of distance, like a middle-class suburban community now, where the houses have a lot of distance so you can't hear the people next door, they were like, wow, well, we're not strangers. We like being able to gather together, to have our children all play together, to give events. We want it in a circle as opposed to a grid. So the minutia of their vision only comes out with specifics where they're interacting with people who are trying to help them, but it's everything from domestic violence on the job should not be a thing. Domestic violence in the home should not be a thing. The first people to go to court about that were Black women. The first case won, but nobody paid attention because it was a Black woman in Alabama. So they thought they could, as women, have custody of children. They had understandings that we ended up first dealing with in the 20th century, but slavery was the lens.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. You describe in the book, one, you challenge a certain periodization of the long civil rights movement, and suggest that we need to look at these activities as not only kind of precursors, but more foundations to a theory of universal human rights. So what changes when we take this longer periodization in the way we think about civil and human rights and the history of the struggle?
Well, I had a discussion about this with my students this week. I was explaining to them about the children in Birmingham volunteering to march and getting the line of fire for the hoses. They were very, very shocked about that. And I said to them, how would an 11-year-old decide to confront their parents about making that decision? What were they basing it on? I know because I was asked to integrate a school across town by my father, who said, it's your decision and you can say no. And I knew that they had already instilled something in me to make me understand without him having to explain the benefits for children coming behind me. I already knew that somehow. And so I think that the beloved community starts really early. If the parent takes an action, they may, in the case of that time period or when I was growing up, take the children also, so that they're not having to really explain it over the dinner table like this is a good thing to do, but instead it's embedded as this is what we do, this is how we do. And I cannot remember a year in elementary school that I was not told that I had to give back whatever skills they were honing for me or in me, that it had to be of use to someone else. So I think when I wrote Confederate Kinfolk, I misjudged that. I didn't think that had survived all the violence of Reconstruction because they killed so many voter registrars and people who were empowered to organize and empower people. And I think I misjudged that totally, that it was still passed on in church over the dinner table, that if someone was taking an action on behalf of all, we should also have his back. So I don't know whether that's still there. I think it was a new idea to most of my students, many of whom are not even from here, but yeah, I think it's a good thing to think about.
Yeah, and you're attentive to memory as a resource in the freedom struggle, right from the 19th through the 21st century. And, one of the ways that you tap this memory is by looking at oral histories and telling the story. And, one of the stories that was really vivid for me is this memory you describe of Charles Grandy, who had been enslaved in Mississippi. And as you describe in the book, he had seen a comet, I believe in 1860 or 1861, as a sign of a coming war against slavery. And then you say, well, he wasn't the only one that had this interpretation, and connected to no less than Walt Whitman, Herman Melville, who also found meaning in this meteor, and connected to John Brown's attack on Harper's Ferry. And so I wanted to ask if you could talk about the importance of oral history as a source of evidence for you in telling the story of the Emancipation Circuit, and if you could reflect on the importance of subjectivity, of memory in the struggle.
Well, when I found Walt Whitman discovered that Abraham Lincoln was a stargazer, so I was really delighted with that. But we know what they thought about those things because they were famous writers. And when it was happening and when they wrote it down, it got printed and people saw it. And I wanted to lift up the Charles Grandys, who were also making observations. These are just human reactions to an amazing phenomenon of nature, but they're interpreting it really around the same issues. So I wanted to put Charles Grandy with Tubman, with Douglass, that people, just to reinforce that the people in the South who were enslaved are also thinking about the times and thinking about signs. Do these things matter? And also, when given the chance to have their story written down, they don't delete that part. They use testimony about their imagination and their belief system, as well as I was sold to Mr. So-and-so when I was 11. And I wanted to lift up that these people in the South were neither silent nor blind and not observant, that we don't have to rely just on the Whitmans and the Lincolns to describe the kind of mood of their times. The people who gave interviews to the WPA were very thoughtful about their first chance to be in history and to connect themselves to history. And the things that they remark on are interesting in that a lot of those things are remarked on by many people. And when these people in Virginia started talking about a snowstorm, it was a revelation to me that people 5 counties away from where it happened were trying to tell an interviewer about a historic event they had witnessed from afar, and that had a drama involved in it where a former mayor had died in the snow. They could even tell you what kind of person he was, even though they'd never seen him, probably didn't know anybody who knew him. But they were addressing the matter of documenting history. So they told what they'd heard. But what it meant to me was all these people had a communication network, that stories could pass among the enslaved 5 counties across Virginia, where all these counties were on the same rail line. So it was useful to me in terms of going, that circuit is at least on the rail line.
Yeah, and so the book is not only an incredible history of Reconstruction that's attendant to these circuits of communication, it's also a geography of the freedom struggle. And you're really attentive to what you call, following Catherine McKittrick's lead, oppositional spatial practices. And you make it vivid through these extraordinarily rendered maps, which I know you did yourself. You worked with cartographers at the University of Wisconsin. And so why is mapping such a critical aspect of your historical work?
I listened in on a talk with her recently about Dear Science, and she was trying to explain to the group that most of the mapping of Black people is mapping of displacement, and is attached to the idea that that's sort of one of the conditions of Black people. We're supposed to be displaced, or something that is an assumption about Black people, that displacement is part of our existence. And she was trying to explain to them mapping something else. And then I said, well, I try to map the activities of Black people. I said, that's what I don't see in mapping, like where they did something. And I said, I didn't tell her all of this, but I tore a tendon in my right foot when I was on my way to Mississippi to do research, and my doctor said, you can't get on the plane. And I was sitting at home for 5 weeks going, I want to know what this looks like. So I took all the material that I had about where people were mobilizing voters, and I started mapping it. And they were just the most obvious communication lines, and you could look at it and go, wow, that's going to be the Chitlin Circuit in the 1920s, because it's exactly the same routes. They're probably traveling in faster trains, but it's the same routes plus some new places where Black communities have developed and built a theater. So it gets more elaborate, but this was a route that I knew James Brown traveled in the 50s to perform, and then I discovered Ma Rainey followed that same route. So it's like taking something that's seemingly always been there and going back, well, when did it start? Where does that start? So it starts with meetings. That's my theory. It is also the route that products are traveling on. So after the Civil War, all the planters, like in Mississippi and Louisiana, wanted to build train lines directly from their farms. But the farms are laid out in lines, and so that train line might have had some guys who loaded at every plantation who could just as easily have dropped the Chicago Defender years later. That's sort of how the Defender got all over the South, because the people working the train lines are invisible in a way in history. If they had a strike on one end of a train line, the word of the strike would, of course, travel among the workers down the line, and it might produce other strikes. Mm-hmm. So that happened in Virginia in 1866. So I just said to myself, we're there, we're just invisible, so let me try to look at a way to make it visible, that there were people carrying information long distances.
Well, yeah, one of the things that you describe in the book, that the Black newspapers, also the presence of the Union Army, obviously, the military, and then labor organizing were kind of three key factors that you map out in each of these places. And so I wonder if you could say a little bit more about this innovative methodology. You're using archival, you're using cartography to actually visualize. So if you could talk about the data sources that you're bringing into view in this mapping.
Oh, okay. I think because I write in other forms, even if I'm looking at the regular data sources, I'm seeing a little bit differently. So for instance, one of the beefs that freed people had with the Union Army was they wanted to live autonomously, and they only felt that they could defend themselves if they lived in a Black community. Most of the ministers who met with Sherman told him, yeah, we need to live by ourselves. The other beef they had was that the Army was willing to put them back to work on the old terms. They wanted to raise food for their own families more than they wanted to raise rice for the families of the world. So the people they were dealing with didn't always want to negotiate a way for them to have greater autonomy and control over their labor to provide for their own families. They really, I don't know what was in their way, whether they thought we weren't really up to thinking the economics of it out, or whether they just didn't care. But I looked at the same documents that they wrote, the military, for instance, but I'm looking not for what they're complaining about, but what issues they keep writing about, and what issues they're continuously trying to work on. So with each state, I sort of highlight one where the documentation is, there's more documentation of people in North Carolina trying to have custody of their families because certain people in certain areas wrote more letters. So there's a way to just look at what is the archive showing us, what are there a lot of letters about, and how do they also call themselves? How do they describe who they are? Because one of the other interesting things that's happening is that they're responding sometimes in the documentation to what they're being called, that they're being called the colored people, or they're being called the former slaves, or something like that. They're not being called freed people, and they are trying to figure out how to be called, to decide themselves what to be called, rather than having somebody just name them. So sometimes it's just how I'm looking, or what I'm experiencing when I read it. Like, what are the locutions they're using? What is it that they're trying to say about who they are while also making their demands? So I think I may have strayed from your question, but
No. Thank you for this. And what you describe, taken together, is what Robin D.G. Kelley describes as the most magnificent achievement since W.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. And I would concur. And Du Bois, of course, is someone you've worked on a long time. After all, we worked with Louis Messiah and others to make W.B. Du Bois a biography in 4 voices. And you follow Du Bois's lead in this book in tracing what I would describe as a dialectic of emancipation and of reaction at the state level. And so you could see the striking resonance. So I wonder if you could describe for us the dialogue with Du Bois in the book.
Well, there are 2 really important things to me that I tell my students all the time. He didn't have the internet, and he couldn't go into any library in the South. And I'm still wondering, did he get libraries in the North to borrow books? And there's something daunting about trying to imagine how he did the work. The WPA wasn't interviewing anybody yet. So he had none of that oral history. He would have eaten that up. And I think I felt like I was taking advantage of the tools I have to go back and look at what he was talking about. So when he talks about people viewing themselves as a labor force, because of course everybody knew they had only been brought here to be a labor force, I could map where they did labor organizing from the documents. And I could prove some points that he was making and trying to warn us about. For instance, he was trying to tell us having a Black majority doesn't mean they'll elect somebody. Having a white majority doesn't mean they won't elect somebody Black. And because of big city elections being the first elections in the 20th century where Black people were elected, we have this vast literature about how you have to have over 50% of the population being Black to elect anybody anywhere, which is just not true. So I went back to the same counties where he pointed out that Black people with a majority of 2 managed to carry the day. And it taught me 2 things. One, those populations that easily won were rural, not urban. And that, I think, is an important point for us to really look at. People assume that they elected Black people from Richmond, but in fact, the majority of the populations were not in cities. Black populations were out there where the crops were being grown, and they organized themselves easily and well. Whereas in the city, if you see a place like Norfolk where their Black majority comes and goes every 10 years, sometimes they're the majority, sometimes not. When not the majority, they still elected people, and I read that as good at politics, good at raising money for their candidates, that there are other skills involved that you read about in the documents, about how movers and shakers were operating. They had to raise a fair amount of money to run somebody even then. So he was, if he had had our access to information, I think he would have really laid that out. But he was very much attuned to the fact that there's no hard and fast rules about where Black people were able to really organize and elect representatives. And he didn't have all the information that we have now about strikes, labor actions. He would have, it was easy for me to go through all the Richmond newspapers from 1863 to 1880 and see what articles are being printed, because the tobacco business was the business. So if there were strikes, it's in the papers, but he would have had to see the actual papers. So God bless him.
Yeah, but you know, he said it was a drama that beggared the Greek, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. And you know, you suggest the importance of Black people being the central actors in the drama, right? And you tell it as a dramatic story, you know, in the way Du Bois suggested. And one of the things that you do in the drama is kind of shift the stories you say from the cities. And since we're in Louisiana, I should ask, you know, in the chapter that you have on Louisiana, you say there were kind of two faces in this dramatic story of Reconstruction in this state. One, the more elite organizing in the city, but the second was, as you say now about Virginia, was in the rural labor organizing, and that the Black agricultural workers were really foundational. And throughout the book, you emphasize the role of labor activism as being central to building the most lasting change. So could you talk about that argument about the role of labor organizing?
Sure.
Yeah.
The first thing I noticed was if I read personal accounts of some of the people who were organizers, political organizers in the South, like what they did later in life, a great number of the men joined the Negro Labor, the National Negro Labor Group that they were trying to form, first in Baltimore and then nationally. The next conferences they went to at the end of Reconstruction were all labor meetings, Black labor meetings in the South and in the West. And they had, some people had been organizers going south. They were against going back to Africa. After the violence they experienced, many of them helped build exoduster and immigration movements. Same people who had guards outside their house because they were organizing voting. And I looked to see where the immigration movements were located from the literature that's there. And those are mostly responses to violence, but the most continuous struggles were with labor. And I think because of how academia works and because of the separation of disciplines, people are not necessarily noting that political organizers became labor organizers because political history is one thing and labor history is another. So I went to look at the labor histories to see where those struggles were. And so it's my contention that in the sugar parishes of Louisiana, they built political organizing, they built continuously labor organizing, for which people brought Gatling guns to stop them. They managed to stay mobilized even with armies coming at them, which didn't happen as much in New Orleans. They had riots there, but the people out in the countryside also in the 1887 strike were working with white workers as well. And also when all of that failed, they built exoduster movements and immigration movements. One of my contentions about it is if you are in a poor community and you're trying to save money to move somewhere, you have to stay organized for years. You have to have meetings for years till people have built $50, saved $50 to take their families west. And also they did this odd thing that I think is a sign of the beloved community. They tried to move whole neighborhoods. So 10 families would stick together in Mississippi till 10 families had the money to take that trip up the river and across into Oklahoma, or let's say only 7 of them finally did, but they organized by community. So the same community that's cutting sugar is organizing over decades and generations for whatever the next response is to life being made unlivable.
Mm. Yeah, you know, it's amazing because you trace these dense networks, you know, through these sites, as I said, at the state level. And one of the states that stuck out for me is my home state of Mississippi, you know, often singularly imagined as a site of repression. But what you show here is that basically, you know, these long histories of voter suppression, for example,
Oh, yes.
and of disenfranchisement can be understood as responses to the Emancipation Circuit. And
I would give you one example.
yeah.
They have not yet elected as many black officials, state officials in Mississippi as they did 150 years ago. So the voter repression really kicks in by 1870. They're redrawing county lines, but it's been consistent. In dividing counties, things like that. They're close to matching the number of people elected in Reconstruction, but it's been a struggle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I wonder if you could talk about that part of it. You know, I mean, one of the things that we know is voter suppression, but there's also other forms of suppression that account for that fact that you don't have the same levels of political power now, not the least of which is the vigilante violence. And, you know, the story of the White League, Klan violence is obviously central to why it is that these communities weren't, you know, allowed to flourish. So I wonder if you could talk about some of that.
Well, I think poverty and poor education, also closing public schools in black neighborhoods, it all is deleterious. I think the vigilante violence was very effective, particularly at the end of Reconstruction. And it just remained a threat. It didn't even have to be done much anymore. People could give a warning and people knew what the warning meant. Also, lynching one person in a spectacle lynching turned out to be very effective in terms of frightening large populations. And if you saw an ad in the paper for a spectacle lynching coming up in the 1890s or whatever, and heard that 500 white people went to watch it, that's like, oh, 500 of your neighbors really think of violence against black people without a proper charge or a proper proof that anything happened at all. It's pretty daunting, and that is actually also the thing that caused migrations. Also, they passed laws that you couldn't leave your own county. Yeah, the threat was that. So if there's a spectacle lynching, if there's 3 a year, they keep them tuned up. It's a really a threat that doesn't have to be made out loud very often. Anybody who visits there, like Emmett Till, needs to know what the rules are, that kind of thing. But their attention to repressing the vote, I think is really important, and I tried to footnote any recent laws in any of the 9 states that are about repressing the vote. I tried to footnote those because the new ones, except for some things having to do with election officials, they are just new versions the old ones. So not letting people who have paid their debt to society, who are former offenders, vote, or not letting them vote without paying all these fines, invented before black males got the vote in 1868. Or they first voted in 1868, they got the vote in 1870. In 1867 and 8, county officials were trying to figure out how to use the one way they could stop anybody from voting, and that was an offense, a conviction for a heinous crime. And so they started snatching guys and punishing them for heinous crimes, even though they might have been just doing nothing or stealing a chicken. They would have on their record, they purposely tried to disfranchise whole counties of black males. So that's all still with us, and I think that's sort of important to be aware of, that people are trying to think of newer ways now, but they're also using the old.
Yeah. You know, you tell this story of this, relation between the geography of emancipation and kind of the geography of repression, if you like. But one of the most enduring lessons, it seems to me, are all the things that freed people focused on in terms of the new institutions. So you describe education as being central. You describe church and family life as being central. You describe the reform of the prison system as being really central. So I wonder if you could talk about some of that vision, the democratic vision. That you described it as a kind of participatory democratic practice.
Well, in freedom, some of the institutions that existed were used to capture black people and make them work for free. So that hadn't been necessary before. Lynching used to be a community punishment for horse thieves, not for being black. And so it comes to their attention instantly that jails, vagrancy courts, and then convict leasing are ways to rebuild the New South, or to build the New South, rebuild the Old South. They were used to build roads. It was a very practical solution in places like Atlanta to just pick people up off the street. The laws didn't even really apply in terms of whether women could be on chain gangs or not. At one point, they tried to define woman as opposed to female. Woman meant white women, and no white women could be on a chain gang, but females could. So it's like, oh, they're replicating slavery. That's how slavery survivors are seeing it. And they're seeing that this justice system that they were hoping would protect them as free people is being used to exploit their labor. So they start bringing attention to that, such that people like Ida B. Wells hear about it as a reality, because she's no longer living in the South, and start addressing it. Same thing with, they have a different view. Also, early on, many freed people wanted black teachers. Because I think their awareness of how they were taught Christianity on plantations was that, and this I think is a part of that political understanding, that how people teach you the facts of something is colored by what they think you need to know for your place in society. So a lot of the school systems in America were sort of geared towards what we want these particular people to do. We want them to learn trades or whatever. But they also understood there was a condemnation of being a person of color embedded in the Christian teaching they had been given, and they were very leery of people who were against black people going to school being the teachers. So they were way ahead in a sense of how people start to look at public education in the 60s, but they're laying the groundwork for all the teachers I had in segregated schools who taught us how to critique the state textbooks that came to our rooms, filthy, used up, falling apart, and saying that Black people contributed nothing to Southern agriculture during slavery except singing, and who made us memorize Black poets, mimeographed information about what did happen in slavery. Their sense, the sense of freed people about education, really, really built the philosophy of HBCUs and the struggles that went on for decades in school systems in the South to get equal pay for Black teachers, and then ultimately students leave the movement to integrate the schools, because also no one had been able to get them to build a decent school for Black children. And even in the 50s, they had outhouses. So the students took on that struggle. But the lens of slavery was also instructive in terms of seeing things that are new manifestations of the outlook of slavery, like, let's just use these people.
Yeah. Well, I asked you about politics, but I should also ask you, I think it's in the chapter on Mississippi, if I'm remembering correctly, this has also a period in which is foundational for the creation of a blues culture. And, I wonder if you could talk about that argument and the intervention that you're making. I mean, you talk about Bessie Smith, you talk about Ma Rainey.
Mm-hmm. Early on in this project, I got possessed of the idea that Black churches were trying to professionalize. They wanted people who'd gone to theology school. There were relatively few people who'd even been to the few Baptist seminaries. But they wanted to professionalize the churches, and they didn't want people in the church doing celebration the way it was done in the countryside. And the first thing they wanted to do was eliminate the elder sisters, who were the saints of the church, from teaching. They wanted to masculinize all these visions they had of national political organizations, national churches, church groups, the National Baptist Church. There's a lot of ideation about bringing, now that we're entering the 20th century, bringing all the Black people into action together, even though none of those groups, political groups like the NAACP, can go organize in the South, and nobody in the South can vote. But they have this vision, and they want it to be very professional in how it's organized and how it appears. So in Mississippi and Arkansas, people who left the Baptist church because they didn't feel welcome as country people, poor people, and as holders of the old ways, started to form these Pentecostal churches. And at the same time, these singers are developing in the plantations like Dockery in Mississippi. And they, I consider the Pentecostal churches somewhat both progressive and conservative. They're usually viewed as highly conservative, and all my friends who grew up in them attest to the fact that they couldn't dance in the house and listen to rock and roll, but they did welcome blues musicians into the church because it was music that everybody listened to. It was indigenous. I'm sure the guys cleaned up some of the language, but they had people playing guitar in church. We now have Kojic as a result, that has the greatest music ministry on the planet, probably. So they are opening up in an era of repression these other forms of expression, and I think also forms that allow processing the trauma of the violence of the end of Reconstruction and the violence that became every day thereafter. That in these churches, they are practicing a form of healing that maybe they had to come up with in that time. Maybe it's ancient, I don't know, but they were serving the community. There were some people who thought that being in the Pentecostal church had saved them from some particular lynching that just happened to be in that church. There are all these new ideas about new metaphors, like about traveling on trains and I'll see you down the line. The church starts to adopt this vernacular that has to do with this new technology of the time and posit it as a place to dream to, so we'll get there down the line. The idea of constant struggle has a sort of momentum added to it at the beginning of the 20th century in these cultural milieus. So Ma Rainey is coming through and showing to the world the freedom of expression that Black women were probably always exercising. And the idea that, no, not all the itinerants and wanderers are men, that I'm a wandering gal, and also giving an outlet for domestic violence, loneliness, the struggle to find one's path, oneself, and oh, you can wear gold teeth, oh, you can wear a wig, oh, you can wear fabulous clothes. It was another form of imagining or envisioning futures. So with the collapse of this possible future of being engaged in governing is this new possible future. What is personal autonomy like? What is dreaming of being able to move around the countryside, seek and build a new future, that kind of thing. So there's, I feel like Mississippi and Arkansas gave us something we really needed in the way of healing that is rarely addressed in terms of history. So I just took that leap, like, okay, now these people are really dealing with the damage that was done in a way other than fleeing, going, migrating someplace else. Tons of people came into Arkansas because they were in Edgefield, South Carolina, where it was really terrible. But if they went to the Pentecostal church, they had a way of processing it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for taking that leap. We're indebted to you for it. Thank you so much, Thulani. And I wonder if there's anything that I haven't asked that you'd like to add.
I guess I'm hoping that we can look at, the reason I end on the note of what persists as political theory is that we're in a time now where a lot of people want to be engaged and they want somebody to mobilize them. They're going to go out and participate. But I hope that we're still taking time to sort of do what people did out of necessity in the era of freedom, and did again with people like Ella Baker in the room, asking them to think through what is their theory of how to make change. I'm hoping, I ask my students this all the time, when they study a contemporary group, I ask them, what's their theory of change? And can we spend some time thinking about how to make change, how to continue making change, but how to make change in this moment, and is it different from how we did it before? For instance, a young man came to talk to us some months ago, and he, aside from teaching, he works in a group or two that deal with incarceration issues in whatever Midwest state he's in. And I said to him, you know, whatever people are concerned about at their penitentiary, that penitentiary serves a lot of counties. Those counties could be in connection with each other in terms of people who are trying to deal with incarceration issues. It's like if it's sitting in the middle of 5 counties, maybe they should all visit each other. And he just looked really startled, and I said, that's what Friedman did. I said, that's part of the history, that they said, okay, this institution is sitting in the middle of all of us. The smallest group of us is 5 counties, let's go talk. So I think about it like that, like, how are you making your analysis?
Well, thank you so much for this
Thank
gift
you.
of the Emancipation Circuit, Black Activism Forging, a Culture of Freedom, out from Duke University Press. Thulani, it's been a real pleasure to speak with you.
For me as well, thank you.
And thanks to all our viewers and listeners for joining us for this episode of Conjuncture. Stay tuned.